When Elena Martinez spent her last $300 on a barren patch of desert at a county land auction, it was a desperate gamble to secure a place she could call her own after losing everything to mounting medical debt. Following her husband's unexpected death from heart failure and the devastating hospital bills that consumed their life savings, she never imagined that a routine soil test would reveal a massive untapped crude oil deposit worth over $180 million beneath her worthless land. A discovery that would make her the target of predatory oil executives, thrust her into high-stakes negotiations with energy corporations, and ultimately lead to a business venture that would forever change her life and transform an overlooked rural community. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The foreclosure notice arrived on a scorching Tuesday afternoon, tucked between an overdue medical bill and a final credit card warning, as if its life-shattering contents were just another piece of everyday mail. Notice of property seizure, 21 days to satisfy outstanding obligations. Elena Martinez stared at the bold red letters, feeling her world collapse as she stood in the tiny kitchen of her rental home in Copper Creek, Arizona. Through the dust-streaked window, she could see the vast expanse of desert that had been both sanctuary and tormentor since Miguel's passing 13 months ago. "Please, not now," Elena whispered, her trembling finger scanning the document for any possible reprieve or extension. There wasn't one. The entire neighborhood had been purchased by a corporate housing developer planning a luxury retirement community. All tenants had 21 days to settle their debts or face immediate eviction. No exceptions, no mercy, no second chances. At 46, Elena had never imagined she would find herself here, a widow with a master's degree in environmental science recently, laid off when her research institute lost its federal funding, and now staring down homelessness in a rental market that seemed deliberately designed to exclude people exactly like her. She set the seizure notice on the weathered kitchen counter and drew a shuddering breath, mentally cataloging her rapidly diminishing options. Her savings had dwindled to exactly $343 after 13 months of legal battles with insurance companies over Miguel's medical coverage, funeral expenses, and a crushing weight of bills that kept arriving even after death had supposedly settled all accounts. Her older sister lived in Chicago and was struggling to support 3 children on a teacher's salary. Friends had already extended themselves beyond reason during those first devastating weeks after Miguel's death. Elena walked to the living room window, her gaze drawn to the distant mountains that shimmered in the relentless Arizona heat. For 15 years, those mountains had been the constant backdrop to her marriage with Miguel, their jagged silhouettes framing the sunsets they'd watched together from their porch, dreaming of the future they were building. Now they stood as indifferent, as she felt ancient, immovable, and unconcerned with human suffering. She lifted the framed photograph of Miguel and herself on their wedding day. His park ranger uniform was crisp and proud beside her flowing white dress, both of them radiant, with the confidence that they could build any future together. "Que harías mi amor?" she asked the silent image, her voice breaking slightly on the familiar endearment. The weight of her isolation pressed down like the Arizona sun at high noon. Miguel had been her anchor, her strategist, the one who always found solutions when problems seemed insurmountable. Without him, every decision felt like navigating a desert without a compass or water supply. Elena had met Miguel Martinez 17 years earlier during the conservation project at Saguaro National Park. She'd been conducting environmental impact research, and he was the park ranger assigned to guide her team through remote sections of the protected wilderness. Their professional relationship had slowly transformed into friendship, then love, as she witnessed his incredible knowledge of the land and passionate commitment to protecting natural resources. Miguel had been the son of Mexican immigrants, a man who'd worked his way up from seasonal park maintenance to full ranger status through sheer determination and an encyclopedic knowledge of desert ecosystems. Elena, whose own family had immigrated from El Salvador when she was 9, understood the pride and purpose he found in protecting America's natural heritage while honoring his cultural roots. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Their wedding had been simple but joyful, held at a small chapel near the national park with the Sonoran Desert serving as their natural cathedral. Miguel's fellow rangers had formed an honor guard as they exited the church, and Elena's research colleagues had created a sustainable native plant garden as their wedding gift. Together, they'd saved every penny to purchase their small home in Copper Creek, choosing the location for its proximity to both the national park and Elena's research institute. Miguel had spent weekends making improvements to their modest house, installing solar panels, creating a water-efficient garden of native plants, and building a workshop where he crafted furniture from reclaimed wood. Elena had established a small greenhouse where she grew herbs and vegetables, finding peace in nurturing life from the harsh desert soil. Those had been golden years, coming home each evening to share stories of their work, planning small improvements to their home, taking long hikes through the desert landscape, dreaming of the children they hoped to have someday. Miguel would point out hidden signs of life in what appeared to be barren terrain, explaining the delicate balance of the desert ecosystem with the enthusiasm of someone who truly loved his environment. But children hadn't come, despite years of hoping and medical consultations that drained their savings. They had eventually found peace in their life together, channeling their nurturing instincts into their work. Elena studying environmental preservation, Miguel protecting the wilderness for future generations. They'd talked about adoption, about travel, about the environmental education center they might establish when they retired. The heart attack had shattered everything in a single moment. Miguel had been leading a school group on a nature trail when he collapsed. Despite the immediate response of his colleagues and the helicopter evacuation to the nearest hospital, the damage was too extensive. Elena's world had ended that Friday afternoon when the hospital called. She'd been collecting soil samples in a remote research site when her satellite phone rang with news that would divide her life into before and after before Miguel, when everything made sense. After Miguel, when nothing would ever make sense. Again, the funeral had been overwhelming hundreds of people whose lives Miguel had touched. Park visitors who remembered his engaging tours, school children who had learned about desert ecology under his guidance, colleagues who had relied on his encyclopedic knowledge of the park's resources. Elena had stood beside his casket, surrounded by mourners, feeling completely alone despite the crowd of people sharing her grief. The insurance battles had begun almost immediately. Miguel's government health plan had initially seemed comprehensive, but the fine print revealed exceptions and limitations that left Elena responsible for massive hospital bills, emergency transport costs, and specialists whose services weren't fully covered. The insurance company disputed the emergency airlift charges, claiming it wasn't medically necessary despite the remote location of Miguel's collapse. Legal fees had consumed their savings with terrifying speed. Elena's attorney, while competent and sympathetic, charged $350 per hour for her services. Medical record reviews, expert consultations, appeals processes, and endless documentation created a financial nightmare that multiplied faster than Elena could track. Meanwhile, her grief made it impossible to focus on work with the intensity her research required. The Environmental Institute, where she'd worked for 14 years, had been understanding at first, granting her bereavement leave and accommodating her emotional struggles. But as months passed and Elena continued to have difficulty concentrating, her supervisor had grown less patient. The institute was under financial pressure as federal research grants became increasingly competitive and focused on immediate economic benefits rather than long-term environmental sustainability. When the Department of the Interior cut their Funding by 30% 8 months after Miguel's death, Elena's position became immediately vulnerable. The termination was delivered with bureaucratic efficiency, a brief meeting with the institute director, a severance package that provided 8 weeks of salary, and expressions of regret that felt hollow against the reality of her sudden unemployment. Elena had signed the paperwork in numb shock, still processing the reality that she'd lost both her husband and her career within a single year. Unemployment benefits provided $1,100 per month, barely enough to cover rent and utilities completely. Inadequate for her mounting medical debt and legal fees. Elena had applied for dozens of environmental science positions throughout the Southwest. But the job market was oversaturated with qualified candidates as similar institutes faced budget cuts, and many employers seemed hesitant to hire someone dealing with obvious personal trauma. The few interview opportunities she'd received had gone poorly. Elena struggled to project the enthusiasm and innovative thinking that research positions demanded, and her extended absence from publication had created gaps in her knowledge of new methodologies and important findings in her field. Younger candidates with recent publications and lower salary expectations consistently received the positions she'd applied for. As her savings dwindled and job prospects remained elusive, Elena had been forced to make increasingly desperate financial decisions. She'd sold Miguel's truck, their camping equipment, and most of their furniture to pay mounting bills. The house that had once been their sanctuary became a constant reminder of everything she'd lost and everything she was about to lose. That evening, after forcing down a dinner of canned beans and rice, all she could afford and stomach, Elena opened her laptop and began the desperate search for affordable housing. The laptop, a battered relic from her fieldwork days, struggled to maintain its connection to their neighbor's shared Wi-Fi, which Elena accessed in exchange for tending the elderly woman's garden twice weekly. The numbers on rental websites might as well have been written in a foreign language for all the sense they made to her financial reality. Studio apartments in Copper Creek started at $1,800 per month, nearly twice what she currently paid for her 2-bedroom home. 1-bedroom units in neighboring towns commanded $1,500 minimum. Still impossibly beyond her reach. Application fees ranged from $50 to $125 per property, meaning she could afford to apply for perhaps 3 places before exhausting her remaining funds. Every legitimate listing demanded proof of monthly income at least 3 times the rent amount, an impossible requirement when her unemployment benefits provided barely $1,100 per month, enough to cover basic groceries and utilities, but nowhere near sufficient for housing deposits, first month's rent, and the mountain of additional fees landlords demanded. Security deposits alone often exceeded her entire remaining savings. Elena spent hours reading rental requirements that seemed designed to exclude people in her situation perfect credit scores, employment verification, landlord references, proof of renter's insurance, pet deposits, even though she had no pets, cleaning fees, application processing fees, background check fees. The list of financial barriers seemed endless and insurmountable. She called several property management companies, hoping to explain her situation and perhaps find someone willing to work with her circumstances. The conversations were uniformly discouraging. Rental agents spoke in rehearsed scripts about policies and requirements, expressing polite sympathy for her situation while making it clear that exceptions were not possible in their competitive market. "I understand your circumstances are difficult," one particularly kind agent had explained, "but we have dozens of qualified applicants for every property. Our owners require us to choose tenants who represent the lowest financial risk. I'm sorry, but your current income situation wouldn't meet our minimum requirements." Elena expanded her search radius, looking at properties an hour inland, where rents dropped slightly but still remained out of reach. She investigated shared housing situations, spare rooms in strangers' homes, converted garages, anything that might provide basic shelter, Each option presented its own complications. Most roommate situations wanted female roommates under 35. Non-smokers with perfect credit, professional references she no longer had, or deposits she couldn't afford. The Craigslist housing section became her obsession, refreshing every few minutes to catch new listings before other desperate people could respond. She found herself competing with college students whose parents could co-sign leases, young professionals with stable incomes, and retirees with substantial savings. Her widow status and unemployment made her an unattractive candidate, regardless of her education or work history. She applied for low-income housing assistance, only to discover waiting lists that stretched for years. Emergency housing programs had residency requirements she didn't meet or were designed specifically for families with children. Social services offered temporary shelter options that required her to surrender her remaining possessions and accept placement in facilities with safety concerns she wasn't prepared to accept. The clock on her laptop read 2:18 a.m. when desperation drove her into increasingly unconventional territory. She began searching for sheriff's auctions, tax sales, repossessed properties, abandoned buildings, any distressed real estate being liquidated to recover debts. Most listings showed dilapidated houses requiring tens of thousands in renovations, empty lots in remote areas hours from any employment, or commercial properties unsuitable for residential use. Her eyes burned from staring at the screen, and her back ached from hunching over the wobbly kitchen table, but she couldn't stop. Each search felt like her last chance to find something, anything, before the 21-day deadline expired, and she found herself homeless for the first time in her life. The heat of the Arizona night pressed against the windows, the ancient swamp cooler struggling to lower the temperature below 85 degrees. She could hear coyotes calling in the distance, their mournful cries matching her growing sense of isolation and desperation. Elena clicked through page after page of foreclosure listings, each more depressing than the last. Mobile homes in flood zones requiring expensive insurance. Condemned houses with foundation problems that would cost more to repair than to demolish. Vacant lots suitable only for farming or industrial use, zoned against residential construction. Her heart sank with each impossible option, each dead end that closed off another potential path forward. She found herself reading the tragic stories behind each foreclosure. Families destroyed by medical bankruptcies. Elderly couples who'd lost homes to reverse mortgage scams. Small business owners crushed by economic downturns beyond their control. Each listing represented someone else's shattered dreams making her feel simultaneously less alone and more aware of how common financial devastation had become. And then, buried on page 5 of the Pima County tax auction listings, she found something that made her pause. Undeveloped desert parcel, 5 acres, Coyote Basin. Minimum bid $300. Property sold as is, no warranties or representations. Inspection recommended. Elena almost scrolled past it. What could she possibly do with an undeveloped desert parcel? But something made her click on the listing. Perhaps the desperate logic that even an impossible shelter was better than no shelter at all. Or maybe the symbolic connection to the desert landscape that had framed her marriage for so many years. The listing contained only 3 photographs. A barren stretch of desert with scattered creosote bushes and a few struggling mesquite trees. A distant view showing the property's location relative to the surrounding mountains. And an aerial shot revealing the parcel situated in an isolated basin approximately 40 miles from the nearest town. The description was frustratingly sparse. Former agricultural test site, 5 acres. Undeveloped desert land with no improvements or utilities. Access via unpaved county road. Property sold as is without warranties. Buyer responsible for all inspections and due diligence. Elena studied the photographs with growing fascination. The land appeared completely unremarkable, typical Sonoran desert terrain with poor soil, minimal vegetation, and no obvious resources or potential. Yet something about the isolated parcel called to her, offering a sense of possibility in its very emptiness. Her exhausted mind began calculating impossible scenarios. The land had no infrastructure, but she could potentially establish a basic shelter, a used mobile home, or even a sturdy tent structure initially. Solar panels could provide electricity. Water would be the greatest challenge, but many rural properties relied on water delivery services or deep wells. The isolation would be extreme, accessible only by an unpaved road that probably became impassable during monsoon season. But it would also mean freedom from landlords, rent increases, and eviction notices. It would be hers, a place where no one could tell her to leave, a foundation for rebuilding when better opportunities eventually emerged. It was completely insane. She was an environmental scientist, not a homesteader or off-grid survivalist. The property was isolated, lacking basic utilities, and would require enormous investments of time and resources she didn't possess. The minimum bid alone would consume most of her remaining savings, leaving nothing for actual development costs. And yet, as she stared at the grainy photographs of the desert parcel, something stirred in her chest that she hadn't felt since Miguel's death. A tiny spark of possibility, a whisper of hope that maybe, just maybe, this could be her solution. Not ideal, not easy, not remotely sensible, but potentially her only path to ownership and independence. Elena imagined Miguel's reaction to the desert land idea. He would have been cautiously practical, but ultimately supportive, already calculating water collection systems and shade structures. Mira Vita, sometimes the hardest ground grows the strongest plants, he would have said, reminding her of their favorite hikes where seemingly barren areas revealed surprising resilience. She researched the parcel's history, discovering that the Coyote Basin had been part of a university agricultural study in the 1980s. Examining drought-resistant crops and irrigation techniques. The project had been abandoned when funding dried up, leaving the land to revert to its natural state. The county had foreclosed on the property when the private owner who acquired it after the university failed to pay property taxes for 7 consecutive years. "This is absolutely crazy," she told herself, closing the laptop and preparing for bed. But as she lay listening to the distant coyotes, knowing that 21 days remained before losing her home forever, the desert parcel continued to occupy her thoughts. What had seemed like midnight desperation began to crystallize into her best, perhaps only option for maintaining any kind of ownership and dignity. The widow, seeking basic survival, had found what might be her most unconventional path forward. The question was whether she possessed enough courage to take it. The morning of the tax auction dawned brutally hot and unforgiving, with heat waves already distorting the horizon as Elena drove toward the Pima County Administration building. She had spent the previous 3 days researching everything she could about off-grid living, water rights in the Arizona desert, and the legal implications of purchasing property at a tax auction. The more she learned, the more impossible her plan seemed, and the more determined she became to pursue it. Elena had withdrawn exactly $320 from her dwindling bank account, leaving her with barely enough for gas and groceries through the following week. The extra $20 beyond the minimum bid was her only insurance against being outbid by someone with slightly deeper pockets. She clutched the cashier's check in her trembling hand as she navigated her aging Honda Civic through downtown Tucson. Traffic, rehearsing arguments to convince herself this wasn't the most reckless gamble of her life. The county building was a modern concrete structure with glass doors leading to an air-conditioned lobby that felt shockingly cold after the outdoor heat. Elena arrived 30 minutes early, hoping to observe the auction process and understand the procedures before her desert parcel came up for bidding. The auction room was already half filled with people in business attire, professional investors and developers, who attended these events regularly, scanning through thick catalogs of distressed properties like shoppers browsing a department Store clearance sale. Elena felt completely out of place in her simple linen dress and worn sandals, clutching her single cashier's check while others around her discussed multiple properties and investment strategies with casual expertise. She registered for bidder number 34, trying to project more confidence than she felt as the clerk explained the rules and requirements. "First time at a tax auction?" asked a distinguished man with silver hair and kind eyes, noticing Elena's obvious nervousness. The man's badge identified him as bidder number 8. Elena nodded, grateful for any human connection in the intimidating environment. "Is it that obvious?" "We all started somewhere," the man replied, introducing himself as David Thompson. "I've been attending these auctions for over 20 years. Are you looking at residential properties today?" "Actually, yes," Elena admitted. "The desert parcel in Coyote Basin. I'm planning to establish a small sustainable homestead." It sounded more impressive than desperate last resort to avoid homelessness. David's eyebrows rose with genuine interest rather than skepticism. "That's fascinating. Off-grid properties present unique challenges, though they offer remarkable freedom. Coyote Basin has excellent solar potential, and the aquifer is deeper than most realize." "What draws you to that particular property?" Elena found herself sharing more than she'd intended about her situation: Miguel's death, the job loss, the impending eviction, her desperate need for affordable land that wouldn't subject her to the whims of landlords or the volatility of rental markets. David listened with the patience of someone who understood that desperate circumstances often led to unconventional solutions. "You know," David said thoughtfully, "desert homesteading isn't as impossible as people assume. The land may look barren, but it's incredibly resilient if you work with its natural patterns rather than against them. The real challenges are water sourcing and thermal regulation. But if you're committed to doing the work yourself and can approach it as a long-term project, it's entirely feasible." This unexpected encouragement from an experienced property investor gave Elena hope that her plan wasn't completely insane. David had successfully developed several off-grid properties, including a solar-powered ranch house that now served as his retirement home. He offered practical advice about water harvesting techniques, solar power systems, and accessing grants available for sustainable development. "The most important thing," David emphasized, "is patience. These properties reward careful, methodical development, but they punish rushing or cutting corners. If you win the bid today, take time to thoroughly assess what you're working with before making any major changes." The auction began promptly at 10 o'clock a.m., with the auctioneer rapidly progressing through a list of foreclosed properties. Elena watched the process with growing anxiety, observing how quickly each property was presented and sold. Most generated little interest, selling close to their minimum bids. But a few prime residential lots sparked bidding wars that drove prices far beyond their starting points. Elena began to worry that she'd misunderstood something fundamental about the auction process. Perhaps desert properties were more valuable than she had realized, or maybe other bidders had information about the Coyote Basin parcel that she lacked. As the morning progressed, Elena's anxiety intensified. Her palms were sweating, her heart rate had accelerated, and she felt increasingly out of place among the professional investors who bid with casual confidence on properties worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. She began second-guessing her decision to risk her last resources on such an uncertain venture. When Lot 17 was announced, 5-acre undeveloped parcel, Coyote Basin, Elena's stomach lurched with a combination of terror and anticipation. The auctioneer provided a brief description of the property, emphasizing the as-is nature of the sale and the buyer's responsibility for all inspections and due diligence. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have an undeveloped desert parcel in Coyote Basin, approximately 40 miles northwest of Tucson. The property includes 5 acres of undeveloped land with no utilities or improvements. Minimum bid is $300. Do I hear $300? Elena's hand trembled as she raised her bidder paddle, her voice catching as she managed to say, "Here. $300 from bidder number 34, the auctioneer announced. Do I hear $350? The room remained silent for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only seconds. Elena held her breath, wondering if someone would suddenly recognize the value of the property and jump into the bidding. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she waited for competition that would price her out of her last option. $300 going. Once, the auctioneer called, scanning the room for additional bids. Do I hear $350? Any advance on $300? A woman in a business suit near the front of the room half raised her paddle, then seemed to reconsider and lowered it. Elena's pulse spiked with panic. If someone bid against her, she could only go as high as $320 before exhausting her resources entirely. $300 going twice, the auctioneer continued. Final call for the Coyote Basin parcel. Any advance? The silence stretched impossibly long. Elena felt sweat beading on her forehead as she realized in a few seconds she would either own 5 acres of desert or have to somehow find another solution to her housing crisis with 21 days remaining. Sold to bidder number 34 for $300. The sharp crack of the auctioneer's gavel made Elena jump. Had that really happened? Had she actually purchased 5 acres of desert for less than the cost of a security deposit on most apartments? The surreal nature of the moment made her wonder if she was dreaming, or if her desperation had finally driven her to complete detachment from reality. The next hour passed in a bureaucratic blur of paperwork, signatures, and transaction processing. The county clerk, a patient woman named Maria Gonzalez, guided Elena through the complex documentation required for the property transfer. She explained that the land had been abandoned for nearly 8 years with property taxes unpaid since the previous owner had declared bankruptcy and disappeared. You should know that this property comes with some unique challenges, Maria advised. As Elena signed document after document, there are no established utilities, and water rights can be complicated in this region. You'll need to work with the county planning office for any structures you intend to build. Elena nodded, trying to absorb the implications while still processing the fact that she now owned land, however problematic it might be. Maria provided her with contact information for the county planning department, environmental health services, and water resource management office that would need to be consulted before any development could begin. Are you interested in the property's history? Maria asked as they completed the final paperwork. Coyote Basin has quite a story. It was part of an agricultural research project, studying drought-resistant crops back in the 1980s. The university abandoned the site when funding dried up, but they did leave some infrastructure, mainly a capped well and some irrigation remnants. The clerk pulled out a thin file folder containing historical documents about the parcel. These came with the property records. There's some interesting information about the soil composition and water table studies they conducted. Might be useful if you're planning any kind of agricultural use. Elena's attention was caught by the mention of a well, though she assumed it was likely dry or contaminated after years of abandonment. Every property in the desert came with water challenges, and she had been preparing herself for expensive water delivery services until she could establish a rainwater harvesting system. The most interesting thing about Coyote Basin, Maria continued, was the anomalous soil readings they recorded during the agricultural study. The university researchers found unusual mineral deposits that didn't match typical Sonoran desert composition. They never fully investigated because it wasn't relevant to their crop research, but there's a notation in their final report about potential geological significance warranting further study. By noon, Elena Martinez, widow, former environmental scientist and now owner of 5 acres of barren desert, clutched a set of property documents in hands that wouldn't stop trembling. The reality of what she'd done was beginning to sink in. She had committed her last financial resources to purchasing a property. She'd never physically visited a location so remote it didn't appear on most maps, with no clear plan for making it habitable. "Congratulations," David Thompson said, finding Elena in the building lobby after the auction concluded. "That was quite an adventure you just embarked upon. I meant what I said about desert homesteading being rewarding. You've acquired something with real potential." "I'm still not sure if I'm brave or completely desperate," Elena admitted, staring at the deed to her desert parcel as if it were written in hieroglyphics. "Sometimes those are the same thing," David replied with a warm smile. "Here's my card. I've worked on several off-grid projects over the years, including a sustainable desert compound that's entirely self-sufficient. Call me if you need advice or contractor recommendations. And don't hesitate to reach out if you need someone to talk through the overwhelming moments. Every development project has them." Elena thanked David and walked slowly to her car, still processing the magnitude of what had just occurred. The drive to Coyote Basin would be her first opportunity to see her property up close, to assess exactly what she had purchased, and begin understanding the scope of work required to make it livable. The journey to Coyote Basin was long and increasingly isolated. Elena followed the interstate northwest from Tucson for 40 miles before turning onto a state highway that grew progressively narrower and less maintained. After another 15 miles, she turned onto a county road that quickly devolved into gravel, then packed dirt with no signage or markings. Her Honda Civic, designed for urban commuting rather than off-road exploration, struggled with the rough terrain. Elena drove slowly, watching the odometer and checking her GPS coordinates against the property description. The road seemed to dissolve into the desert itself, becoming little more than a suggestion of previous passage across the harsh landscape. After nearly 2 hours of driving, Elena reached what appeared to be the boundary of her property. She parked her car on slightly higher ground, hoping to avoid the flash flood paths that carved through the basin, and stepped out into the crushing afternoon heat. The silence was absolute. No traffic noise, no human voices, nothing but the occasional whisper of hot wind through creosote bushes and the distant cry of a circling hawk. Elena stood beside her car for several minutes, trying to absorb the reality that this desolate stretch of desert now belonged to her. The landscape appeared almost lunar in its barrenness. Scattered vegetation clung to life in the harsh conditions: creosote bushes, prickly pear cactus, and a few struggling mesquite trees that had somehow established themselves in a dry wash that cut across the property. The ground was hard-packed desert soil with a light coating of fine sand that swirled in miniature dust devils with each gust of wind. Elena walked the perimeter of what she believed to be her property, using the GPS coordinates from her deed to identify approximate boundaries. The 5 acres formed a rough rectangle with no distinguishing features except for a slight depression near the center, where rainwater might occasionally collect during the rare desert downpours. There was no sign of the capped well mentioned in the county records, though years of sand and dust could easily have covered any remnants of the university's research project. Elena made notes on her phone, marking potential areas for exploration and development, places where natural contours might support water harvesting, and locations that offered some protection from the relentless sun. As she walked, Elena began to notice subtle variations in the landscape that might not be apparent to casual observation. Certain areas supported slightly different vegetation patterns, suggesting variations in soil composition or water availability. The university researchers had documented anomalous soil readings, and Elena's trained eye began to detect possible explanations for those anomalies. The afternoon heat became unbearable as the sun reached its zenith. Elena retreated to her car, cranking the air conditioning to its maximum setting while reviewing her notes and property documents. The immediate challenges were overwhelming: no water, no shelter, no electricity, no sanitation facilities. Just 5 acres of harsh desert that somehow needed to become her home within 3 weeks. Elena had brought basic camping supplies, thinking she might spend the night on her new property to better understand its characteristics. But the reality of the isolated location and extreme conditions made her reconsider. She would need far more preparation before attempting even temporary habitation in this unforgiving environment. As she prepared to leave, Elena noticed something unusual in the distance. A slight discoloration in the soil pattern, approximately a quarter-mile from where she had parked. Curious, she decided to investigate before departing, walking carefully across the rough terrain toward the anomaly. As she approached, the discoloration resolved into a circular area approximately 10 feet in diameter, where the soil appeared darker and slightly raised compared to the surrounding terrain. Kneeling beside it, Elena noticed small fragments of metal and deteriorated rubber, possible remnants of equipment or infrastructure from the university's research project. Using a small trowel from her camping gear, Elena carefully scraped away the surface layer of soil, revealing what appeared to be a metal cap or cover partially buried beneath years of accumulated sand and dust. With growing excitement, she cleared more material, exposing a circular metal plate approximately 3 feet in diameter with a rusted handle in its center. The capped well, Elena breathed, realizing she had discovered one of the key infrastructure elements mentioned in the property. Records. The well's existence dramatically changed her development prospects. If it could be restored to functionality, it would solve her most critical challenge: access to water in the desert. Elena tried to turn the handle, but years of exposure had fused the mechanism solid. She would need proper tools and possibly professional assistance to determine whether the well was still viable. But its discovery transformed her 5 acres from completely undeveloped land to property with at least some existing infrastructure. As she cleared more soil from around the well cap, Elena noticed something else unusual: dark, slightly oily soil unlike the typical desert composition. Her environmental science background immediately recognized this as potential contamination, though the source wasn't immediately apparent. The university's agricultural research wouldn't typically involve petroleum products in sufficient quantity to leave this kind of residue. Curious, Elena collected a small sample of the unusual soil in a plastic bag. She would test it later to determine whether it represented an environmental concern or perhaps explained the anomalous readings the researchers had documented. The sun was beginning its descent toward the western horizon as Elena reluctantly prepared to leave her property. She had accomplished her primary goal, confirming the existence and boundaries of her purchase and identifying its key features. The discovery of the well exceeded her expectations, though its condition and viability remained unknown. The drive back to Tucson gave Elena time to process what she had learned and begin formulating a development plan. The immediate priority was establishing some form of basic shelter before her eviction deadline. With 21 days remaining, she would need to work quickly to create even the most rudimentary living situation on her desert property. That evening, Elena spread her notes and property documents across her kitchen table, alongside printed resources about desert homesteading, off-grid living, and sustainable water systems. The challenges were immense, but she forced herself to approach them systematically, the way she'd once developed research methodologies for complex environmental studies. She created a prioritized list of needs: water access, basic shelter, sanitation, food storage, and power generation. Each category presented unique challenges in the desert environment, but also opportunities for sustainable solutions that worked with the natural conditions rather than against them. Water was the absolute priority. Without confirming the viability of the well, Elena would need alternative sources. Rainwater harvesting offered potential, though the infrequent desert downpours meant she would need extensive collection surfaces and storage capacity. Water delivery services could provide temporary supply, though the remote location and poor road access would make this expensive and unreliable. Shelter requirements were equally challenging. Conventional construction would be impossible given her timeline and resources. She explored options for temporary structures, tents, yurts, converted shipping containers, or used travel trailers that could provide immediate housing while she developed more permanent solutions. As midnight approached, Elena realized she had filled several pages with plans, requirements, and potential resources. The task remained daunting, but no longer seemed completely impossible. She had land, increasing knowledge, and a growing determination to create something meaningful from her desperate circumstances. Before going to bed, she remembered the soil sample she had collected near the well. Using basic household materials, glass jar, water, and a small amount of dish soap, she conducted a simple separation test to examine the soil composition. The results were surprising. Rather than the expected mixture of sand, clay, and organic material typical of desert soils, the sample separated into distinct layers with an unmistakable rainbow sheen on the water's surface. Elena stared at the jar with growing amazement. Her environmental science background recognized the implications immediately. The anomalous readings in the university research weren't just unusual mineral deposits. The oily sheen and separation pattern suggested something far more: significant potential petroleum deposits beneath her seemingly worthless desert parcel. Crude oil, Elena whispered, her scientific mind racing through the implications. The simple home test wasn't definitive, but it strongly suggested petroleum deposits beneath her seemingly worthless land. The university researchers had noted anomalous readings, but abandoned their investigation when agricultural funding dried up. They had been looking for ways to grow crops in harsh conditions, not prospecting for energy resources. Elena spent the next morning researching soil indicators of petroleum deposits, confirming that her initial assessment was scientifically plausible. The rainbow sheen, distinctive separation pattern, and unusual soil coloration all matched known indicators of subsurface crude oil deposits. The property's location in a basin suggested geological conditions that could trap petroleum deposits beneath the surface, a depression where millions of years of organic material might have been compressed into valuable hydrocarbons. But confirming a suspicion was vastly different from proving the existence of commercially viable oil deposits. Professional testing would require specialized equipment, geological expertise, and significant investment resources Elena simply didn't have, with eviction looming just 20 days away. She faced an impossible dilemma. If she revealed her suspicions to potential investors or energy companies, they might exploit her vulnerable position and desperate timeline. But without external resources, she couldn't confirm or capitalize on what might lie beneath her desert parcel. "Think, Elena," she muttered, pacing her small kitchen. Her environmental science background had given her extensive knowledge of soil testing and geological assessment, but petroleum geology was a specialized field requiring expertise she didn't possess. She needed allies with both knowledge and integrity, people who wouldn't take advantage of her precarious situation. She remembered David Thompson, the silver-haired investor who had offered guidance at the auction. His card listed Thompson Sustainable Development with a Tucson address and phone number. While his focus seemed to be environmentally conscious projects rather than fossil fuel extraction, his decades of experience with land development might provide valuable guidance. Elena called the number, relieved when David himself answered, rather than an assistant or receptionist. "Mr. Thompson, it's Elena Martinez. We met at the county auction yesterday when I purchased the Coyote Basin parcel. I wonder if I might ask your advice about something unusual I've discovered." David agreed to meet that afternoon at his office in downtown Tucson. Elena carefully packed her soil sample and the property documents, including the university research notes mentioning the anomalous readings. She felt simultaneously terrified and exhilarated carrying Potential evidence of a discovery that could transform her desperate gamble into something extraordinary. Thompson Sustainable Development occupied the top floor of a modest office building with solar panels covering the roof and xeriscape native plants surrounding the entrance. The interior reflected similar values: reclaimed wood furniture, energy efficient lighting, and large windows providing natural illumination. David greeted Elena warmly, showing her to a conference room with a spectacular view of the Santa Catalina Mountains. "So, what's this unusual discovery that couldn't wait?" David asked after they were seated with glasses of water. Elena carefully explained her background in environmental science, her soil testing experience, and the simple experiment she'd conducted the previous night. She showed him the sample jar with its distinctive separation pattern and rainbow sheen, then shared the university research notes about anomalous readings. "I believe there may be petroleum deposits beneath my property," she concluded. "But I have no way to confirm this without specialized testing, and I'm concerned about approaching energy companies, given my vulnerable financial position and tight timeline." David studied the soil sample with a thoughtful expression, then reviewed the university notes carefully before speaking. "Your assessment is scientifically sound," he said finally. "These are indeed indicators that would warrant professional investigation. The question is how to proceed without putting yourself at risk." He explained that speculative petroleum exploration was a complex and often predatory industry. Large energy corporations routinely used aggressive tactics to acquire potential drilling rights from vulnerable property owners, offering pennies on the dollar for resources that might be worth millions. If you approach them directly, they'll immediately recognize your desperation and time constraints. They'll offer you just enough to solve your immediate housing crisis, perhaps $30,000 or $50,000 for complete mineral rights, knowing the potential value could be exponentially higher. The scenario David described confirmed Elena's worst fears. In her current financial situation, even a modest offer would seem like salvation. How could she refuse $50,000 when facing homelessness in less than 3 weeks? Yet accepting such an offer might mean surrendering resources worth vastly more. "There's another approach," David continued, "but it requires patience and partners you can trust. I have connections with an independent geological survey company that specializes in ethical resource assessment. They could conduct preliminary testing under a confidentiality agreement, giving you accurate information about what's beneath your land without alerting the major energy corporations." "How much would this testing cost?" Elena asked already, knowing she couldn't afford even basic services. "Normally, around $15,000 for preliminary assessment," David replied. "But I might propose an alternative arrangement. My company has been looking to diversify into responsible resource development projects that extract necessary resources while minimizing environmental impact and ensuring fair compensation to property owners." He proposed a partnership structure. Thompson Sustainable Development would fund the geological assessment in exchange for a 25% interest in any confirmed resources. Elena would retain 75% ownership and decision-making authority regarding development approaches. Most importantly, they would operate under a legally binding agreement that prevented any sale or development without mutual consent, protecting Elena from being forced into premature decisions by financial desperation. "Why would you do this?" Elena asked, suspicious of generosity that seemed too perfectly timed. "You're risking $15,000 on what might be nothing more than unusual soil composition." David smiled, acknowledging her skepticism. 3 reasons. First, I've been looking for opportunities in responsible resource development, and this timing is fortunate. Second, I believe in helping people avoid the predatory practices I've witnessed throughout my career. And third, calculated risk is the foundation of successful investment. I've developed good instincts over 30 years, and something about your property intrigues me. He suggested she take time to consider his offer and consult with an attorney before making any decisions. Elena thanked him for his guidance and promised to reflect carefully on the potential partnership. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The drive back to her soon-to-be former home gave Elena time to process this unexpected development. 24 hours earlier, she had been facing imminent homelessness with no apparent options. Now she was contemplating a partnership that might transform her worthless desert parcel into a valuable resource if the preliminary indicators proved accurate. Her scientific training demanded skepticism. Soil indicators weren't definitive. Proof of commercially viable petroleum deposits. The testing might reveal nothing of significance, or deposits too small or inaccessible for practical extraction. Building hope on such tenuous evidence seemed dangerous when disappointment could be devastating. And yet, something about this possibility felt right, as if the universe were finally offering balance after taking so much. Miguel had always believed in cosmic equilibrium, the philosophical concept that suffering eventually gives way to opportunity for those who remain attentive and persistent. Elena spent the evening researching petroleum rights, mineral development partnerships, and David Thompson's business reputation. His company had an impeccable record for ethical development practices, environmental responsibility, and fair treatment of property owners. No lawsuits, no complaints with regulatory agencies, and several awards for sustainable project design. The following morning, she contacted a small legal aid office that offered consultation services on a sliding fee scale. The attorney, Sarah Rodriguez, specialized in property rights and resource development contracts. She agreed to review the proposed partnership agreement for a nominal fee, recognizing Elena's financial constraints. "This is actually quite fair," Sarah observed after examining the document David had prepared. "The 75/25 ownership split strongly favors you, and the mutual consent provision prevents forced development decisions. I'd suggest a few minor modifications to strengthen your position further, but overall, this appears to be a legitimately equitable arrangement." With the attorney's recommended changes incorporated, Elena signed the partnership agreement 3 days after purchasing her desert property. David immediately scheduled the geological assessment team, arranging for preliminary testing to begin the following week. Meanwhile, Elena focused on her immediate housing challenge. With eviction just 17 days away, she needed to establish basic habitability on her desert parcel, regardless of what might lie beneath it. David introduced her to Carlos Mendez, a contractor who specialized in off-grid construction and sustainable desert living solutions. Carlos visited the property with Elena, conducting a thorough assessment of the immediate challenges and potential solutions. His pragmatic approach was reassuring after days of theoretical possibilities and uncertain futures. "Water is your first priority," Carlos confirmed, examining the capped well Elena had discovered. "This well needs professional rehabilitation, but initial indicators suggest the aquifer is intact. We could have basic water access restored within 2 weeks if we prioritize this work." For temporary shelter, Carlos recommended a used travel trailer that could provide immediate housing while longer-term solutions developed. Solar panels with battery storage could supply basic electricity needs, and a composting toilet system would address sanitation requirements without expensive septic installation. The total for basic habitability rehabilitated well, used travel trailer, minimal solar setup, and composting sanitation would be approximately $12,000, Carlos explained. "That's cutting every possible corner while still maintaining safety and basic comfort." The figure might as well have been $12 million given Elena's financial reality. She had less than $40 remaining after the property purchase, with no capacity for additional debt or expenses. Even basic habitability seemed impossibly out of reach, regardless of what might eventually be discovered beneath her land. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. David listened to Carlos's assessment with thoughtful attention, then made an unexpected proposal. My company could advance the $12,000 as part of our partnership agreement. We'd structure it as a development loan against future resource proceeds, with no repayment required if the geological assessment reveals nothing of value. Elena's immediate instinct was to refuse. She had already accepted the testing partnership, and additional financial entanglement seemed dangerous. But facing homelessness in 17 days concentrated her thinking with brutal clarity. Pride wouldn't provide shelter when her eviction deadline arrived. "I accept your offer," she said quietly, with profound gratitude and the promise that I'll honor this generosity regardless of what we discover. Work began immediately on rehabilitating the well and preparing the site for Elena's temporary home. The well service team confirmed Carlos's initial assessment. The aquifer remained viable, requiring only equipment updates and proper sanitization to provide clean water. The access road needed minimal grading to accommodate delivery vehicles, and a level area was prepared for the travel trailer installation. While this essential work progressed, the geological assessment team arrived to conduct preliminary testing. Using non-invasive ground-penetrating radar and soil sampling techniques, they systematically surveyed the 5-acre parcel, paying particular attention to the area surrounding the discolored soil where Elena had collected her sample. The team worked methodically for 3 days, gathering data and samples without offering preliminary conclusions. Their professional discretion was both reassuring and maddening. Elena desperately wanted to know whether her hopeful theory had any scientific validity, but appreciated their commitment to thorough analysis before drawing conclusions. On the 4th day, Dr. Raymond Wilson, the lead geologist, requested a meeting with Elena and David. They gathered in Elena's newly delivered travel trailer, which had been positioned near the rehabilitated well with a basic solar power system already functioning. The modest shelter represented extraordinary progress from barren desert to basic habitability in just 1 week. Dr. Wilson spread several technical diagrams and reports across the trailer's small dining table, his expression carefully neutral. As he began his presentation, "Our preliminary assessment indicates significant hydrocarbon deposits approximately 900 feet beneath the surface of the eastern portion of your property," he explained, pointing to colored overlays showing subsurface formations. The geological structure suggests an isolated petroleum pocket formed by unusual folding in the underlying bedrock, essentially a small but concentrated oil reservoir. Elena felt her heart rate accelerate as Dr. Wilson continued his explanation. The technical details confirmed what her simple soil test had suggested: petroleum deposits existed beneath her seemingly worthless desert parcel. "What does significant mean in practical terms?" David asked, his voice carefully measured. "Based on our preliminary data, we estimate a reservoir containing between 1.5 and 3 million barrels of medium-grade crude oil," Dr. Wilson replied. "At current market prices, that represents a potential gross value of approximately $150 to $180 million before extraction costs and taxes." Elena felt the blood drain from her face as the figure registered. $180 million. The number seemed entirely abstract, disconnected from her reality of counting pennies for basic necessities. Just 2 weeks ago, she had been facing homelessness with $343 to her name. Now scientists were calmly discussing potential resources worth more money than she could conceptualize. "How certain are these estimates?" she managed to ask, her scientific training asserting itself through the shock. "Preliminary assessments typically have a confidence interval of plus or minus 35%, Dr. Wilson explained. Definitive confirmation would require exploratory drilling, which is considerably more expensive and invasive. However, our non-invasive testing shows strong indicators consistent with petroleum deposits in the estimated range. He continued with technical details about extraction methods, environmental considerations, and regulatory requirements for developing the resource. The petroleum pockets isolation meant extraction would be relatively straightforward from a technical perspective, though permits and environmental impact studies would be required before development could proceed. As Dr. Wilson concluded his presentation, David turned to Elena with an expression of genuine amazement. It appears your desperate gamble may have struck oil in the most literal sense. The question now is how you want to proceed. Elena struggled to process the implications of this extraordinary discovery. The immediate housing crisis that had dominated her thinking for weeks suddenly seemed trivial compared to the decisions now facing her. Development options, environmental considerations, financial management challenges she had never anticipated were now urgent priorities. I need time to think, she said finally. This changes everything, but I don't want quick decisions on something this significant. David nodded approvingly. That's exactly the right approach. There's no rush now. You have resources worth developing properly rather than hastily. Dr. Wilson provided a comprehensive written report before departing, emphasizing that all findings remained confidential under their agreement. No public records had been created, and no regulatory filings had been initiated. Elena retained complete control over how and when to proceed with development. That evening, Elena sat outside her modest travel trailer, watching the sunset paint the desert in brilliant golds and purples. The transformation of her circumstances seemed as dramatic as the changing light across the landscape darkness, giving way to illumination, desperation yielding to possibility. She thought about Miguel and what he would have advised in this extraordinary situation. His environmental ethics had been central to his identity, informing every decision about resource use and development. He would have seen this discovery as both opportunity and responsibility, a chance to demonstrate that resource extraction could be conducted with minimal environmental impact and maximum community benefit. As darkness fell across Coyote Basin, Elena began formulating a development approach that would honor Miguel's values while securing her future. The petroleum deposits represented wealth beyond her imagining, but their true value lay in how they were developed and the legacy they created. The following morning, Elena called David to discuss next steps. Rather than rushing toward extraction and immediate profit, she proposed a more measured approach, one that prioritized environmental protection, sustainable development, and community benefit. I want to establish a development model that challenges industry standards, she explained. Minimal surface disruption, comprehensive ecological restoration of the entire basin, zero-emission extraction technology, and a commitment to investing profits in renewable energy research. David listened with growing enthusiasm as Elena outlined her vision. This approach aligned perfectly with his company's sustainable development philosophy while potentially establishing new standards for responsible resource extraction. It will increase development costs and extend the timeline, he cautioned. Traditional energy companies would maximize short-term profit at the expense of these considerations. I've lived with nothing for long enough that I don't need everything immediately, Elena replied. Doing this right matters more than doing it quickly. Together, they began developing a comprehensive plan that would transform Elena's accidental discovery into a model for responsible resource development. The plan included several innovative components. First, establishing a land trust that would permanently protect 80% of the property as restored desert habitat, with development activities restricted to the smallest possible footprint on the remaining 20%. Second, implementing cutting-edge extraction technology that minimized environmental impact, with zero-emission equipment and comprehensive monitoring systems to prevent contamination. Third, creating a community benefit agreement that would direct a percentage of profits toward local education, healthcare, and infrastructure improvements in the surrounding rural communities. Fourth, establishing a renewable energy research foundation funded by petroleum proceeds, essentially using fossil fuel wealth to finance the transition away from fossil fuel dependence. The plan would require additional partners, regulatory approvals, and significant initial investment. But with confirmed petroleum reserves worth $180 million, they had leverage to negotiate favorable terms and attract partners who shared their vision for responsible development. Over the following weeks, Elena's life transformed from desperate survival to purposeful creation. The travel trailer remained her home, but its simplicity became a choice rather than a necessity. The well provided reliable water, solar panels generated sufficient electricity, and the desert surrounding her temporary dwelling no longer seemed barren. She began to see the subtle beauty and resilience in its seemingly harsh landscape. Development plan progressed methodically, attracting interest from environmentally conscious investors and specialized contractors with expertise in low-impact extraction. Regulatory agencies responded favorably to the comprehensive environmental protections incorporated into every aspect of the project. 3 months after purchasing her desert parcel for $300, Elena signed the final development agreement with a consortium of partners committed to her vision of responsible resource extraction. The agreement valued her 75% ownership stake at $112 million, with development costs and profit sharing structured to ensure both immediate financial security and long-term sustainable income. The woman who had faced homelessness with $343 to her name now had the resources to create lasting positive impact, not just for herself, but for the environment and community she had unexpectedly joined. Her desperate gamble had revealed not just petroleum beneath the surface, but her own resilience, determination, and capacity for principled leadership. As extraction preparation began with careful site planning and minimal disruption, Elena started designing a permanent home on her property, a self-sufficient dwelling powered entirely by renewable energy, constructed with sustainable materials, and integrated harmoniously with the desert landscape. The house would stand as physical testimony to her belief that human needs and environmental protection could coexist through thoughtful design and respectful implementation. She established the Miguel Martinez Environmental Research Foundation, named for her late husband, dedicated to desert ecosystem restoration and sustainable resource management. The foundation would eventually be headquartered in a research facility constructed on the protected portion of her property, where scientists could study desert adaptation strategies and develop innovative conservation techniques. The widow, who had spent her last $300 on seemingly worthless desert land, had discovered more than petroleum beneath its surface. She had found purpose, possibility, and the opportunity to create meaningful legacy from what had begun as desperate survival. The journey from foreclosure notice to groundbreaking innovation had transformed not just her circumstances, but her understanding of resilience, opportunity, and responsible stewardship. Elena's story spread through the sustainable development community, inspiring others to reimagine resource extraction through an environmental lens. Her willingness to prioritize responsible practices over maximum profit challenged industry standards and demonstrated that ethical development could be both environmentally sound and economically viable. The barren desert parcel that had seemed like her last desperate option had become the foundation for transformation far beyond personal financial recovery. It had become the birthplace of a new model for balancing resource utilization with environmental protection, proving that sometimes the most valuable discoveries lie beneath the surface of our greatest challenges. 1 year after the discovery of oil beneath Elena Martinez's desert parcel, The landscape of Coyote Basin had transformed in ways both visible and invisible. The extraction operation occupied just 3 acres of her 5-acre property, its footprint minimized through innovative drilling techniques and careful site planning. The facility resembled a research station more than a traditional oil field. Sleek, quiet equipment designed for minimal environmental impact, powered largely by solar arrays that flanked the access road. What had begun as a desperate gamble to avoid homelessness had evolved into a groundbreaking model for responsible resource development. Energy industry publications had featured Elena's project as a case study in environmental stewardship, highlighting the zero-emission extraction technology, comprehensive monitoring systems, and commitment to habitat restoration throughout the broader basin. The Martinez method, as industry insiders had begun calling her approach, challenged conventional wisdom that maximizing profit required sacrificing environmental considerations. By prioritizing long-term sustainability over short-term gains, Elena had actually increased the project's overall profitability while dramatically reducing its ecological footprint. The morning sun cast long shadows across the desert as Elena stood on the observation deck of her newly completed home. Striking structure of sustainable materials that seemed to emerge organically from the landscape rather than imposing upon it. The house incorporated passive solar design, rainwater harvesting, and advanced energy storage systems that allowed completely off-grid operation despite modern amenities. Ms. Martinez, the delegation from the Environmental Protection Agency has arrived, announced Sophia, her project coordinator. They're eager to see the habitat restoration work before the midday heat. Elena nodded, gathering her presentation materials. The EPA visit represented significant validation of her approach. Federal regulators were considering the Martinez method as a potential template for new standards in resource extraction on environmentally sensitive lands. As she walked toward the meeting area, Elena reflected on the extraordinary journey of the past year. The transition from desperate widow to influential environmental innovator still felt surreal at times, as if she were observing someone else's life. Yet each morning brought new evidence that this transformation was both real and meaningful, not just for her financial circumstances, but for the broader conversation about balancing resource needs with environmental protection. The EPA delegation consisted of 3 senior officials and a team of environmental scientists who specialized in arid ecosystem protection. Elena led them on a comprehensive tour of the property, beginning with the extraction facility itself. Traditional drilling operations typically disturb 15 to 20 acres for a project of this scale. Elena explained as they observed the compact facility. We've reduced that footprint by 85% through directional drilling techniques and integrated equipment design. Everything you see here operates on closed systems with zero emissions and comprehensive leak detection technology. The lead EPS official, Dr. Patricia Ramirez, nodded appreciatively. The monitoring data you've shared shows ambient air quality actually improving since operations began. That's unprecedented in petroleum extraction. Environmental improvement alongside resource development isn't just possible, it should be the standard. Elena replied. The additional investment in advanced technology pays for itself through operational efficiency and elimination of environmental remediation costs. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The tour continued to the habitat restoration areas that constituted 80% of Elena's property. Here, the transformation was even more dramatic. What had been barren, disturbed desert was now carefully managed habitat showcasing native vegetation. Restoration techniques developed in partnership with university researchers. We've documented a 340% increase in native plant diversity and a corresponding rise in wildlife populations, Elena explained, indicating motion-activated cameras that tracked animal movement throughout the property. These ecosystem improvements extend well beyond our boundaries, creating wildlife corridors that connect previously fragmented habitats. The most impressive aspect of the restoration program wasn't just its ecological benefits, but its integration with the extraction operation. Produced water, the mixture of water and petroleum that emerges during drilling, was typically a problematic waste product in oil production. Elena's team had developed an innovative purification system that transformed this waste into irrigation. Resource for habitat restoration, turning an environmental liability into a regenerative asset. The traditional model treats environmental protection as a regulatory burden that reduces profitability. Elena told the delegation as they gathered in the project's education center. We've demonstrated that ecological stewardship can actually enhance economic outcomes when incorporated as a core design principle rather than an afterthought. The education center itself embodied this integrated philosophy, constructed from sustainable materials with minimal disturbance to the surrounding landscape. The facility served multiple purposes: research headquarters for the Miguel Martinez Environmental Foundation, community education space for local schools, and visitor center for industry professionals studying the project's innovative approaches. As Elena concluded her presentation, Dr. Ramirez expressed what many visitors felt upon seeing the project firsthand. What you've created here goes beyond compliance or even best practices. It's a fundamental reimagining of how resource development can function. The most remarkable aspect is that this came from someone outside the industry who approached the challenge without preconceived limitations. Elena smiled, recognizing the truth in this observation. Her lack of industry experience, initially a disadvantage when negotiating with petroleum professionals, had ultimately become her greatest strength. She hadn't been constrained by conventional thinking about what was possible or practical in oil extraction. Sometimes the most valuable perspective comes from outside the established frameworks, she acknowledged. I approached this project as an environmental scientist first and an oil developer second. That ordering of priorities changed everything about our implementation. After the EPA delegation departed, Elena returned to her office in the education center to review progress on the project's community benefit initiatives. The financial success of the extraction operation had enabled investments far beyond her original plans, creating ripple effects throughout the region. The Copper Creek Community Development Fund, established with 15% of the project's profits, had already renovated the local medical clinic, funded teacher salaries for expanded STEM education, and constructed affordable housing for essential workers. These investments addressed critical needs while creating economic opportunities that would outlast the finite petroleum resource. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Elena reviewed applications for the next round of community grants, noting the increasing sophistication of proposals as local organizations developed capacity to implement larger projects. What had begun as simple financial assistance was evolving into true community empowerment. Residents identifying their own priorities and developing solutions tailored to local needs. A knock at her office door interrupted her review. David Thompson entered with a smile that suggested important news. In the year since their partnership began, David had become not just a business associate, but a trusted friend and mentor. His guidance had been invaluable as Elena navigated the complex worlds of resource development, financial management, and environmental policy. The university research team just submitted their quarterly report, David announced, placing a tablet on Elena's desk. You'll want to see these results immediately. Elena reviewed the document with growing excitement. The habitat restoration techniques developed on her property were showing extraordinary results in broader application across similar desert ecosystems. Native plant species were establishing more successfully, soil moisture retention had improved significantly, and wildlife populations were responding positively throughout the test areas. "This goes beyond our property," Elena said, looking up from the report. "These methods could transform land management across the entire Southwest." David nodded, his expression reflecting the significance of this development. "The restoration work may ultimately prove more valuable than the petroleum itself. You've created a blueprint for desert ecosystem recovery that could impact millions of acres of degraded habitat." This potential for broader impact had always been Elena's hope that the accidental oil discovery would enable environmental innovations with applications far beyond her 5 acres of desert. The Miguel Martinez Environmental Research Foundation was funding projects throughout the region, developing replicable models for habitat restoration, water conservation, and sustainable desert living. Elena's phone chimed with a calendar reminder. In 30 minutes, she would host a virtual meeting with students from her former university, sharing insights from the Coyote Basin Project as part of an environmental leadership seminar. These educational outreach programs had become an increasingly important aspect of her work, inspiring the next generation of environmental scientists to approach challenges with creativity and determination. As she prepared for the presentation, Elena reflected on how dramatically her perspective had evolved. The desperate widow facing homelessness had seen only barren, worthless desert when she purchased her property. Now she recognized the intricate beauty and resilience of arid ecosystems, the complex relationships between soil microbiomes, native vegetation, and wildlife that created life in seemingly inhospitable conditions. This shift in perception paralleled her personal transformation. What had appeared to be the worst period of her life, losing Miguel, her job, and her home in rapid succession, had ultimately led to unexpected opportunity and purpose. The challenges that had seemed insurmountable had actually prepared her for this unlikely role as environmental innovator and community builder. The students' eager faces appeared on her screen as the virtual seminar began. They represented environmental science programs from universities across the country, drawn by the growing reputation of the Coyote Basin Project as a model for integrated resource management. "Before I share the technical aspects of our work," Elena began, "I want to emphasize something more fundamental. The most valuable resource in environmental innovation isn't technology or funding, it's perspective. Seeing possibilities where others see problems. Recognizing that constraints often become catalysts for creativity." She shared her journey from desperate property purchase to groundbreaking development model, emphasizing the critical decision points where conventional approaches would have yielded very different outcomes. The students were particularly interested in how she had maintained her environmental values while navigating the petroleum industry's traditional practices. "I refuse to accept the false choice between economic viability and environmental protection," Elena explained. "By rejecting that fundamental premise, we were forced to develop new approaches that achieved both objectives simultaneously. The key was treating ecological considerations as design requirements rather than regulatory obstacles." After the seminar concluded, Elena walked through the habitat restoration area, observing the evening activities of returning wildlife. Desert cottontails emerged cautiously from brush shelters constructed during the restoration process. A family of Gambel's quail moved in organized formation between native plants, now thriving under carefully designed water harvesting systems. 2 years ago, she could never have imagined finding peace in this harsh landscape. Now she recognized the desert's profound lessons about resilience, adaptation, and finding abundance in seemingly scarce conditions. The ecosystem's capacity to recover when given appropriate support mirrored her own journey from devastation to renewal. Elena's phone rang, interrupting her reflections. The caller ID showed Maria Gonzalez from the county clerk's office. The woman who had processed her property purchase documentation 18 months earlier. "Ms. Martinez, I hope I'm not disturbing you," Maria began. "I wanted to let you know that another parcel near your property is coming up for tax auction next month. Given what you've accomplished with your land, I thought you might be interested in the opportunity to expand your restoration work." The adjacent parcel was considerably larger, 20 acres of similarly degraded desert with comparable geological features. The minimum bid was set at $1,200, reflecting its perceived worthlessness in conventional development terms. "Thank you for thinking of me," Elena replied. "I'd definitely like to learn more about this opportunity." As she ended the call, Elena felt a familiar stirring of possibility. The success of her initial project had created both resources and knowledge that could be applied to broader habitat restoration. Expanding the model would increase its environmental impact while creating additional opportunities for research and community benefit. Elena remembered standing in her tiny kitchen 18 months earlier, staring at an eviction notice and feeling her world collapse around her. That moment of desperation had led to a $300 gamble on seemingly worthless desert, a decision that appeared reckless then, but had proven transformative in ways she could never have anticipated. The following morning, Elena convened her advisory team to discuss the potential land acquisition. The group included David Thompson, Dr. Janet Kwan, the research director for the Environmental Foundation, Carlos Mendez, now supervising the Habitat Restoration Program, and several community representatives who provided perspective on local priorities and needs. Expanding our footprint would allow implementation of landscape-scale restoration techniques that aren't feasible within our current boundaries, Dr. Kwan explained, displaying satellite imagery of the surrounding basin. The additional acreage would create continuous habitat corridors connecting to public lands on the eastern boundary. The environmental benefits were compelling, but Elena insisted on comprehensive consideration of all implications. "We need to evaluate this opportunity from multiple perspectives: ecological, financial, and community impact. If we move forward, it must advance all aspects of our mission simultaneously." The team developed an integrated assessment framework, examining how additional land acquisition would affect everything from wildlife movement patterns to educational program capacity to local employment opportunities. The analysis confirmed Elena's instinct: expansion would enhance the project's impact across all dimensions. 2 weeks later, Elena stood before the county commissioners, presenting a proposal that went far beyond simply acquiring the adjacent parcel. Her vision encompassed the entire Coyote Basin, a comprehensive restoration initiative that would transform a degraded landscape into thriving habitat while creating sustainable economic opportunities for surrounding communities. The success of our initial project demonstrates what's possible when we reject false choices between environmental health and economic development, Elena told the commissioners. "We're proposing a basin-wide approach that builds on these proven methods, creating a model with regional and potentially national significance." The proposal integrated private land acquisition, public-private partnership for managing county-owned parcels, and collaborative research initiatives with state universities. Funding would come from multiple sources: continued profits from the petroleum operation, foundation grants, research partnerships, and carbon sequestration credits generated through verified restoration outcomes. The commissioners responded with unprecedented enthusiasm, recognizing the potential for their economically challenged county to become a national leader in sustainable development. They authorized county participation in the initiative and directed staff to identify additional parcels that might contribute to the basin-wide restoration vision. As the project's scope expanded, Elena remained grounded in the fundamental principles that had guided her approach from the beginning: environmental stewardship, community benefit, and integrated solutions that transcended traditional boundaries. between conservation and development. 6 months later, Elena stood on a ridge overlooking the expanded restoration area, now encompassing over 200 acres of recovering desert ecosystem. University researchers moved methodically through designated study plots, documenting plant establishment rates and soil moisture improvements. Local students participated in citizen science projects, learning environmental monitoring techniques while contributing to actual research data collection. The expanded initiative had created 32 permanent jobs: restoration specialists, research assistants, education coordinators, and habitat maintenance technicians. Most positions were filled by local residents who had received specialized training through programs established by the Miguel Martinez Environmental Foundation. Beside Elena stood Lucia Vasquez, a high school senior who had participated in the project's education programs since their inception. Lucia had recently been accepted to the University of Arizona's Environmental Science program, the first in her family to attend college with a full scholarship from the foundation. "What I love about this work is how it changes your perception," Lucia observed, gesturing toward the landscape below. Before the restoration, people saw this land as worthless, just empty desert with no value. Now we understand its potential and importance. Elena smiled, recognizing her own transformed perspective in the young woman's words. That's the most important restoration of all, changing how we see the world around us. Recognizing value where others see emptiness. As they descended from the ridge, Elena noted new growth emerging from recently restored areas: tiny seedlings, pushing through soil that had been compacted and degraded for decades. The transformation wouldn't happen overnight. Desert ecosystems evolved over centuries and required patience to recover from disturbance. But the process had begun, and each small success built momentum toward larger regeneration. The journey from desperate property purchase to groundbreaking environmental initiative contained lessons that extended far beyond Elena's personal experience. Her story demonstrated how crisis could become catalyst, how limitations could inspire innovation, and how unconventional perspective could transform seemingly worthless resources into extraordinary value. The widow who had spent her last $300 on barren desert land had discovered that true wealth wasn't measured solely in financial terms. The oil beneath her property had provided financial security, but the real treasure was the opportunity to create meaningful legacy environmental restoration that would continue improving long after the petroleum resource was exhausted. As the sun set over Coyote Basin, painting the desert in vibrant oranges and purples, Elena reflected on Miguel's favorite saying about desert ecosystems: "Life here doesn't announce itself loudly. You have to look closely to see its miracles." The same could be said about opportunity in the midst of crisis, value in overlooked places, and the potential for renewal after devastating loss. The Environmental Monitoring Station recorded steadily improving metrics: increasing biodiversity, improving soil health, recovering wildlife populations. These scientific measurements validated the project's ecological success, but they couldn't capture its deeper significance as a model for integrated solutions to seemingly intractable challenges. Elena's approach had demonstrated that environmental protection and economic development could be complementary rather than competitive, that thoughtful design could satisfy both imperatives simultaneously. This fundamental insight was spreading beyond Coyote Basin, influencing resource management practices throughout the region and gradually shifting industry standards toward more sustainable approaches. The former environmental scientist who had faced homelessness after losing everything had transformed not just her personal circumstances, but the conversation about how humanity could interact with natural systems. Her desperate gamble on worthless desert had yielded discoveries far more valuable than crude oil: new models for restoration, innovative approaches to sustainable development, and pathways for communities to thrive while healing damaged ecosystems. As darkness settled over the basin, Lights illuminated the education center where community members were gathering for an evening presentation on desert ecology. The facility had become a vibrant hub for environmental learning, drawing visitors from across the country to study the innovative approaches pioneered in this once forgotten corner of the Arizona desert. The transformation of Coyote Basin mirrored Elena's personal journey from desolation to abundance, from crisis to opportunity, from isolation to community. The seeming catastrophe that had forced her desperate land purchase had ultimately revealed unexpected possibilities that would have remained hidden in more comfortable circumstances. Perhaps that was the most valuable lesson of all, that our most difficult challenges often contain hidden gifts if we maintain the courage to move forward and the vision to see possibility where others perceive only emptiness. Elena's story wasn't just about striking oil in the desert. It was about discovering that our greatest resources often lie beneath the surface of our deepest struggles. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.